Welcome to another episode of Remember the Great Sports NBA 2K20 roster edits. Today I'm going to do the Indiana Pacers all-time team roster edits, and I'm going to just say this to start out. This is probably the one roster on the game that needs the most work, in my opinion, than any other roster in this game. And I'm not going to rag too much about how Reggie Miller's not on the game, because that's become a thing every year, so to speak, and I have to create him every year. But he's definitely a player that is highly omitted from the all-time Pacers team. But the other thing I want to point out is there are two other Hall of Famers that are not on the all-time Pacers team that were very important parts of their history. So maybe one day the folks at NBA 2K will get the permission to do those characters, but until then, I recommend creating them, and we're just going to go through the stock roster, and I'm going to tell you which people I'm going to delete. And this video is going to be a little bit longer because I have 7 deletions and additions to this roster. So let's just jump right into this. And before I get too much further, I always like to say, as a disclaimer, these are simply my recommendations for the all-time Pacers. And that's the beauty of the NBA 2K franchise, is that you can create the rosters to your own liking for your most enjoyable gameplay. So the stock roster starts out with a great Indiana Pacer in Paul George. And that's followed up by Jermaine O'Neal. Then we have Pacers great George McGinnis. And for the first time, very happy to see Freddie Lewis represented on NBA 2K. I have created him in years past, and this is arguably a potential Hall of Fame caliber player. I feel that this guy's numbers are strong enough that maybe one day he will get in the Basketball Hall of Fame. So we'll stay tuned and see. And next you have Danny Granger at small forward / power forward. And this is Victor Oladipo. And I'm not sure if he was on the all-time Pacers last year, but he is definitely this year. And he's had some very strong numbers the last couple seasons, and of course the start of the NBA 20 season as well, or 2019-20 season. So I think he's earned his spot on the all-time Pacers, so we're going to leave him on this roster. Then you have Rik Smits. Then you have Chuck the Rifleman Person at small forward, former Rookie of the Year. You have former Pacer center Roy Hibbert, Jalen Rose, Herb Williams, Clark Kellogg, who was a great player for a short stint of time in the early 80s for the Pacers, Mark Jackson, Detlef Schrempf, Lance Stephenson rounds out the end of the roster. So I've said this many times that I have some people that I recommend that you delete, and I'm just going to start at the back here, and I'm just going to start deleting a lot of people. So I start with deleting Lance Stephenson, Detlef Schrempf, Mark Jackson, Clark Kellogg, Herb Williams, Jalen Rose, and Roy Hibbert. And I leave everybody else intact on this team. So the last 7 people on this roster are my recommendations to delete, and you can interchange some of these out if you don't want to. That's perfectly fine. So let me show you the people that I added to this roster that I think need to be represented on the all-time Indiana Pacers team. Alright, so here are your starting lineups for the all-time Pacers team, and right off the bat you have point guard Freddie Lewis. And I talked about Freddie Lewis a little bit already, but he is one of the best to play in the ABA years for the Indiana Pacers. He also played for the St. Louis Spirits, I believe, during his ABA career, but a great point guard for many years for the Pacers franchise. And again, the first person I add is Reggie Miller. Reggie Miller has not been on the game, I don't think, ever. So every year I have to create Reggie Miller to make my all-time Pacers list, and maybe hopefully one day the creators of NBA 2K and Mr. Miller can come to some agreement, because if we have an opportunity to play as Reggie Miller and not have to create him all the time, I think many people will really enjoy doing that. And if Reggie ever sees this video, please consider letting us enjoy playing as you, because we really would be a neat thing to do. So the starting small forward is Paul George. You slot him and Reggie Miller out there together, and you have one of the best 2-3 combos they could possibly even think of. At the starting power forward position is Hall of Famer George McGinnis. George McGinnis was an integral part of the Indiana Pacers during the 1970s. Very great, good player for a long time with the Pacers. Got into the Hall of Fame. And this is the next person to great, and that is Mel Daniels. And Mel Daniels is a kind of undersized center, but he was kind of like in the mold of like Wes Unseld, where he only stood about 6'9", but he was a very good dominant force under the boards, could play some really good defense. He would chuck in 12 to 15 points a game, but this is a Hall of Famer for the Pacers and was a very important part of their championship teams during their run when they were successful. Now backing up Mel Daniels is Jermaine O'Neal. He can play both the power forward and the center position, so I guess he's not really backing up Daniels. He's more backing up McGinnis in this instance. And this is the third player that I add to the roster, and that is Roger Brown. And a lot of people may not know who Roger Brown is, but Roger Brown, also a Hall of Famer in the Naismith Basketball Hall of Fame, was the small forward / shooting guard, more small forward than shooting guard, for the Indiana Pacers. And when I was compiling this list, I actually found an article about Roger Brown where Reggie Miller said that Roger Brown is the best Indiana Pacer to ever play the game. And this is Reggie Miller saying that. So if Reggie Miller is saying Roger Brown's the greatest Pacer ever, you have to have the greatest Pacer ever on the all-time Pacers team. So Roger Brown, definitely look in the link below. In the description, I have a basketball reference link. Definitely type this guy's name in basketball reference, and you will see some pretty amazing stats about this guy, and he just belongs on this roster. Now, the next guy that I add to this roster is kind of the point guard before Freddie Lewis, and this is Don Buse, I believe is how it's pronounced, or Buse, and he went by the nickname Boo, so we'll go with Buse. So Buse was the point guard when Freddie Lewis wasn't there. So during the successful years before Freddie Lewis was there, Don Buse was there. And Don Buse was not a big-time scorer by any means, but he was one of the best defenders in the game in the ABA during his era. He would basically be glued to the point guard position, the best point guard on the other team. So when you're playing the teams such as the all-time Knicks with Walt Clyde Frazier, or any of those teams with great point guards, this is definitely a defensive upgrade from Freddie Lewis to guard that point guard. Now, the backup center, not Jermaine O'Neal, will be Rik Smits. And Rik Smits, longtime Indiana Pacer, the Dunking Dutchman they called him. Great player to have as a backup center, already on your lineup. So the 10th man is the backup shooting guard, and this is Billy Knight. And Billy Knight, again, was on those successful ABA championship teams. He's not a Hall of Famer, but one could argue that, like Freddie Lewis, he belongs in the Hall of Fame. And this guy was a great mid-range player. He could dunk the ball, with some of the best of them. And I put him slotted in as the backup shooting guard to Reggie Miller on this team. And of course, you can swap Paul George to shooting guard. You can even probably move Roger Brown to shooting guard. But this is the backup shooting guard on this list that I feel that he needs to be added to this team. So I don't know if NBA 2K can get to the rights, to use his likeness or not. But I did my best to create him. Now, staying on the roster is Danny Granger. Now, Danny Granger is valuable because he can play the small forward and the power forward position, and there's a couple guys on this team that can do that. But I keep him slightly on there because of his track record with the Pacers. As you can see here, he had some very good years before he got injured, and you can almost see the drop-off there in 2012, 2013, that when he tried to come back from his injury, that was pretty much it. So I keep him in the lineup as the backup small forward to Roger Brown. Then I decided to keep Victor Oladipo on this team, and the reason I kept him on there, he's been with the Pacers for 3 years. I think he's going to be one of the best Pacers ever. I mean, obviously we don't have a crystal ball or know what's going to happen during the free agency period or anything like that. But as of right now, this guy is a light you up scorer. He's a great guy to play shooting guard, but he can also play the point. So he can serve in two roles, being the backup shooting guard or being the backup point guard. And that leads me to the 13th player on this list. And this guy is probably the most obscure, and you're probably going to be like, who's this guy? And this is Bob Netolicky, or Netolicky. I'm not sure how to pronounce that, but we'll go with Netolicky. And Bob Netolicky was the power forward on the successful Indiana Pacers teams that also won the championships back in the 1970s. So you're kind of seeing a trend here that some of these older players from the 1970s are all but forgotten because they didn't really play once the NBA merger happened, once the ABA folded. So Bob Netolicky, he was a pretty big power forward, 6'9", I believe, and he could play defense. He could get 10 to 12, 15 rebounds a game. He can play the power forward or the center position. So he can be the backup power forward or the backup center. And we'll talk about another player like that here in a second. So these two players are kind of interchangeable, in my opinion, between Netolicky and the next gentleman I'm going to show you. Actually, the person after Chuck Person. Now, I'll just reveal my final guy on the list is Dale Davis. If you remember Dale Davis, he was on the successful Pacer teams, the Davis brothers, with Reggie Miller, Rik Smits, Mark Jackson, on down the list. And Dale Davis is one of those defensive rebounding specialists, paint beasts as they call them on this game, that could grab 10 to 15 to 20 rebounds a game, but he could play some very solid defense. He can play the power forward position or the center position. So, with that said, being he's the 15th man on the roster, you certainly could swap him with Netolicky around and be perfectly fine. The reason that I keep Chuck Person on the bench is there's just way too many small forwards on this team, and as much as it hurts me to put the rifleman on the bench because he's pure three-point shooter, I just put Danny Granger a little bit above him on the list. Now, I know some of the people that are watching this are going to say, hey, what about Ron Artest or Meta World Peace or whatever name he goes by, Meta World Artest now, or I'm not really sure, but Ron Artest was a great player. I'm not going to deny that, but if you were to remove Danny Granger and or Chuck Person, that's who would probably have to go to make this team, because if you were to remove Bob Netolicky or Dale Davis, I guess you don't need both of them on the roster, but if you added Artest, then you have three small forwards all play the same type of position. So Ron Artest just slightly does not make this list, and I know some people may not like that because a lot of people enjoy watching Ron Artest, but Artest didn't play as long as these players did with the Pacers, and that's why I pretty much decided to omit him from this list. The only exception is Victor Oladipo. I think Artest obviously has more time than him, so if you wanted to remove Oladipo, that's perfectly fine, but again, you're stuck with having a bunch of small forwards on the team. So, who coaches this team? The great Bob Leonard, or Bobby Leonard. And again, this picture is not the best of him. This is all that I had to work with. But Bob Leonard was the coach of the Pacers when they won their championships in the 1970s in the ABA. And I believe he worked in their front office for many, many years after the ABA-NBA merger, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong on that. So, hopefully, you agree with my roster changes. This video is a little bit longer, but when you have to delete 7 people and add 7 more, it takes a lot of time to do that and go through all that. Now, any of the players that I deleted are certainly great players, otherwise they wouldn't be on this game. I just feel that you can't omit 3 Hall of Famers off of this list. You know, guys like Don Buse, for example, You could probably make an argument that there's a better point guard, such as Mark Jackson or, Billy Keller even might be a better example than Don Buse, but I enjoy using Buse because he's the defensive specialist, ball handler, assist guy. He's not a scorer. So if you prefer more scorers on your team, you might want to replace Buse with somebody else that's a point guard, that's a scorer. So hopefully you agree with my selections. I look forward to your comments below, and thank you again for joining me for another episode of Roster Updates.